one.
Get my disguise on.
And we're back with another episode. Danny and Troy show. I was thinking
I'm
about
Troy
your
Sadowski.
sunglasses. Yeah, I was thinking maybe I could like get a full face mask. You know, like those anonymous hacking mask. We could disguise our voices with one of those.
Great. You're talking about the gunpowder plot, right? This I have one of those masks.
Do you?
I do, yeah. Just go to Google, buy one. It's like $15.
Yeah.
It's what is it? V for Vendetta.
That's it. Yeah.
That's the movie.
Right.
And it's always nice to have one around. Then I got a hockey mask in case I want to be, like some kind of horror story guy.
Sure.
Right. But V for Vendetta.
Mm-hmm.
And who was that guy with the gunpowder plot? What was his name? Do you remember?
I don't know.
You're going to Google it real quick, I know. But anyway, that's a great movie. If you haven't seen V for Vendetta, check it out. This guy gets burned apparently, and then the end of it is great when they blow up Parliament. Oh, it's great film. Guy
Pearce. Guy Pearce.
Who?
Guy Fawkes.
Fawkes. That's it. Gunpowder plot. Right. We used to have a Guy Fawkes Day when I was going to high school, and on Guy Fawkes Day, it was permissible for guys to come to school dressed as a woman.
Really?
Well, now you don't need a Guy Fawkes Day. You can come dressed as a woman every day, even if you ain't one, right? All right, yeah, but that was it. Sadie Hawkins Day. That was the other one. Sadie Hawkins Day and Guy Fawkes Day.
Wow.
Sadie Hawkins. I don't know who Sadie Hawkins was, but all this stuff coming back to me now.
What could you do on Sadie
I do
Hawkins
not
Day?
still have the dress I wore on Sadie Hawkins Day or Guy Fawkes Day. I've different size now.
Sure.
So I'd have to, and my tastes have changed. I don't know. I like crepe better than I do silk now. So I don't know. It's so many decisions to make,
Well, I get that luxury here in Bhutan anytime I want because their national dress is like it's kind of like
it's kind of like the Scott mystique. Are you wearing underwear underneath that wrap? Well, of course, we Scots Irish. What I need underwear for? It just makes it harder to take a piss on the heather, or on the heath, or on the bog, or wherever you are. Doesn't make sense. Anyway, but we don't want to tamper with the textile industry. No. They'll come and get me. They'll forbid me using their towels or something. It's like, who needs your towels anyway? Yeah, I got paper towels now, huh? I don't think paper towels are owned by the Scots, but you never know. Could be. So today's torture session is going to concentrate on consciousness. We pick some doozies, don't we? All right, doozies. Okay. Yeah, why not? Let's talk about pudding, vanilla pudding. My favorite. But I like making vanilla pudding from scratch. You just got eggs in it and flour and cream and milk and vanilla extract. Well, it's like we have a dish here in the South that we call banana pudding. And it comes with Nilla vanilla wafers. They got the box. Now it's like $6 for a box of crack cookies that are like vanilla wafers. And it's like, I don't like vanilla wafers that much. Give me 3 bananas, the recipe on the side of the box for making vanilla pudding. And then the box, you line a dish, on the outside, and then you cut the bananas into like slices that look like coins. and then another layer of wafers, and then you pour the pudding between the layers, and you keep the whites to when you can whip them and put them on top of the whole thing and then shove them in the oven.
Right.
My grandmother used to make banana pudding. I mean, I couldn't have grown up without it. It's just not possible, you know, and particularly when the meringue is like brown on top, you know, and it looks like a sea. Right, oh man, some just really good stuff. I miss it. Now I'm going to make a banana pudding.
Sounds like a good
all
idea.
Based on levels of consciousness.
Okay.
Okay, what a pregnant topic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm going to just shove it off on you right away, of course, because, you know, I know quite a bit about consciousness. I did a dissertatia on consciousness, Сознание по-русски, да? Сознание. All right. So, Troy, why don't you just shut me up and just take it away and tell people what consciousness is, and is not waking up after a drunk, okay? I mean, I know you're in Australia and all that, so that would be like the first definition, but let's see if we can go a little deeper.
Sure. Yeah. Well,
all right.
Actually, I don't know if I was going to start on the wrong path there, but I mean, not exactly that, but you know, the two, when it comes to consciousness, there's two obvious aspects. One is being asleep and one is being, you know, awake like we are now. And
so you're talking about conscious and not consciousness, just to be clear.
Well,
okay.
Yeah.
So are you conscious?
There, I guess. So yeah, I mean, I understand the aspect of consciousness. I mean, we've been talking about awareness and
Elliot-ness.
Yeah, and process and objectivity.
Joke. Untouchables.
All right, Elliot.
Such an asshole today. Go ahead.
And on that, I mean, on the surface, okay, I'm not going to go deep first, but you know, most people would agree that there are at least two levels, if we want to say levels, or we can call them categories to not mix up with, I'm sure, what you're going to talk about, deeper levels of consciousness, but categories of consciousness. One's being awake, where you interact with, you know, people and objects, and the other is when you're
asleep. Part of the woke culture? No,
could be. I mean, that's pretty cool. We should be on that bandwagon. Everybody else is. But
of course, go ahead.
Then, yeah, when you're asleep, you have these amazing, well, sometimes experiences of flying across from one end of the planet to the other, or swimming with dolphins. This is my experience. Not last night, but yeah, I have a recurring dream. Usually it involves swimming in the ocean where I don't have to take a breath, and I visit, I mean, yeah, dolphins are there usually, and big waves, and I can, yeah, it's like flying actually, but in the sea. And the ocean is always crystal clear water, and yeah, it's really enjoyable, and it happens often. Maybe not that, like once a month I'd have that kind of memorable dream of swimming in the ocean. But yeah, there are two really distinct categories, I think, and that most people would agree, that exist when it comes to living consciousness. And but yeah, I understand, being here in Bhutan, there's another kind of aspect of getting in touch with that consciousness, that deep level of drive that, we wouldn't be able to be awake or be asleep if we didn't have this underlying level of consciousness that said, before we were born, or before we actually came as a living entity, sperm and an egg, even those aspects will have, I think, some level of consciousness for them to exist in a space that allows them to come together and form a human
Can you
being.
define consciousness for me? I'm interrupting. Can you define consciousness for me and how it is different from awareness?
Yeah, so that was what I was thinking as well.
Didn't I? Go ahead. Keep rolling.
Consciousness, in this deeper aspect, is that we have, it's kind of like the space for awareness. So consciousness, I don't want to mix terms, but there's kind of an energy or a field that is empty of just a space for things. And as soon as it kind of, there is a transition between the space and the thing filling the space. So that I think the space, I like to refer to that as consciousness. And when the mixture of these things, a space for a thing and the thing itself, allows for awareness, and consciousness itself, without being existing in a realm like we have right now, would just be consciousness and wouldn't have I guess the environment to feel aware.
Can you simplify that for me?
Sure. The space.
I can hear it now. Go ahead. Google says, yeah.
I'm quickly Googling it. So the underlying space, in order for anything to exist, there needs to be a space for it to be in existence. But
really? You think so? So you're saying that existence is only possible in space-time continuum, which provides it's kind of like a mental perspective where you have dimensionality, right? Which provides perspective and triangulation. So you're saying that consciousness is not possible without space?
I'm talking about a deep, not outer space, or even the space when we take everything, like move the world out or look in a empty cup. I'm not talking about that space. I'm talking about the
conceptual space.
Yeah, it's more of a conceptual space. Even for a thought to exist, it needs to have a space. In that space, I believe, has a level of intelligence. And not to give, I'm struggling for the right words, but if we say, okay, it has purpose and reason and intelligence, then it exists in another realm of our understanding of what we, like the fishbowl that we're in right now, as what we just described, everything that we can knowingly know about, all of that is existing, and there is an emptiness or an empty space that allows that to exist. And that has a consciousness, an ultimate intelligent consciousness that kind of bubbles, forms up. So in this realm, there's formlessness. So the space is formlessness. It's formless. And then once it bubbles into our reality, it becomes form. And those forms can be like human beings like us, or thoughts like we're having, or planets, stars, chemicals, atoms, even down to the smallest identifiable components.
Are you saying that all of those aforementioned components actually have consciousness?
I think so. Yeah, even a rock has consciousness, but it's just not complex enough to be, or care, or think about its own existence, its own awareness.
Okay, let's say we have a block of granite, right?
Okay.
Presumably, that block of granite, according to what I understand, has, careful with the words here, consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I break that block of granite into many, many different parts, do all of the parts maintain the original sense of consciousness, or do they form their own individual sense of consciousness?
The first one. I mean, they don't have the complex nature like a human brain to actually consider, oh, now I've been broken and I am now individual splinters of consciousness. In some ways, the consciousness that I'm talking is infinite and constant.
So it'd be like anima and animus, or Gaia. You're looking at the planet, right? And you would say that the planet in and of itself has a certain level of consciousness about itself.
So
may I go on for just a second? Because I'm trying to reach a sense of clarity here.
Yeah.
That in some ways, well, is in conflict or needs more substantiation in order for me to understand the proposal that you're making.
Sure.
I'll start with giving you what you gave to me. It's like my understanding of what consciousness is, and then we can marry the two and see if we can reach some better understanding about why we should even be speaking about consciousness in our or through our own ignorance or unsophisticated way of looking at consciousness. I mean, I actually believe that consciousness could be represented mathematically, right? That if we had a mathematician that was good enough and we could explain it in a way in which it could be translated into pure science, then I would go for a mathematician to say, give me a formula. Now, it may take, an Einstein or somebody like that in order to establish certain variables, certain substances, procedures, processes, or whatever, which would come together in a mathematical sense or scientific sense to establish an irrefutable definition of what consciousness is. Lacking all of that, I have thought about it for a while, a few years, and asked myself, of course, to myself, what is consciousness? Well, the first word that springs to my attention is awareness, right? But for me, consciousness applies to itself, right?
Sure.
That it has a certain nature by which it recognizes itself to be something and not to be something at the same time. It's like there are different qualities that are recognized in terms of giving this, well, let's just call it an article or a thing, some sense of presence, right? I do equate presence with consciousness. And I would say in order to establish that sense of consciousness, following my previous statement, is that consciousness is actually tension. That you can imagine, pulling a rubber band, for instance, right? Does a rubber band that's not being stretched have consciousness? Or is it being stretched? Does being stretched enable it to have a different sense of consciousness due to the tension that is being applied to the molecular structure that establishes it as a thing?
Right.
So for me, and I can't explain it, I'm just running my mouth, is that consciousness is a tension between two items minimally, or even an item, one item itself can be in contraposition or contradiction to itself. Right? So in order to be, and I'm going to play with a word here, consciously aware of something, requires one portion of consciousness, maybe the source of consciousness, to have a sense of identity. Who am I, right? And if I am alone and by myself, there's no tension. But if let's just take for instance, a guy and a girl. And in the old days, right, we have a level of comparison, a level of interaction, a level of difference between two different people, two different things, which would establish a difference between them. And the statement of that difference accentuates the level of consciousness. And I believe that consciousness is a mental process, right? And we'll get back to your rock in a minute.
Okay.
That it identifies itself, and identity, as you know, from my definition, is unity in movement, right? So you've got movement, which establishes an image, and in order for something to have an identity, it is unity in movement. So I relate to or identify with something that can only exist because it's moving, like me. And so there's certain similarities between these two objects, if you'll let me speak this way, that recognizes itself in another. And because if it was the same thing, you wouldn't see it. But if you're looking at something that is similar, simulacrum is the word that comes to mind, or an image of itself, then it must be moving. And that means, of course, that the moment it is something, it becomes something else. It's never static, right? So that I would say that of consciousness, it's constant motion, constant process of identification, that I would be conscious of something not being a part of me. And in that process, it's impossible to define, because the moment I define it, the definition is no longer valid because it's already something else.
Sure.
So that tension between what something is and what something seems to be, right, would create a sense of differentiation, an identification of what it is about something in a world that exists other than me being the only thing in that world, would create a sense of tension. You can call it curiosity, you can call it need, you can call it nourishment, right? Which all of these elements tend to sustain the idea that I'm a conscious being, aware, to use that word, of change. And this is, of course, I mean, we can talk about the basics of it, but it's also, just to keep true to our mission, something that a person must be aware of, must be cognizant of, must be sensitive to, in order to establish their own sense of identity with another thing, or not necessarily a thing, and which lends itself to like positivism and materialism, but it also lends itself to energy flow, or creativity, or dream world.
Sure.
Because in that dream world that you were discussing, you can also have lucid dreams, right? Which is actually a change in or of consciousness, because you are suddenly aware that you are dreaming, right? So you're sort of like playing the field between the dream and a waking reality.
Yes.
So, and where you can actually change the course of events in this dream state, right? Which really is not so different than if you look at your life or what it is you're trying to accomplish as a dream. My dream come true. In the US, it's, the dreamers, which were the young people, it's all for political purposes. But to be more clear about it, you have established a certain sense of wakefulness, right? That we are beginning to explore the realms of different levels of consciousness, but trying to keep it on a very basic level so it can blossom out in the many directions in which it will be utilized, creates the sense of a field or a creative space or conceptual space, right? That if you are conscious of something, I tend to believe that you are exploring the root energy that you have of being conscious of something. You can be conscious of a dream. You can be conscious of, something that you want. You can be conscious of someone at different levels. And I think that we can manage that. And you mentioned also that this conceptual space, and you're giving it a certain identity, which branches it out enormously when you start talking about intellect, and intelligence of the particulate matter that comprises this conceptual space, which I think at least must have 4 different dimensions, length, depth, what's the other one? Length, width. I would also say mass. I would add mass to that. And then, of course, the other portions of that would be time. So that's 5 dimensions already, right? That exist in something that doesn't exist, which I think in and of itself leads to our next topic, which I think we've decided will be inspiration, or the envelopment or the intersection of other elements. Maybe it's another consciousness or another conscious being or another level of consciousness that creates another entity, which I would like to call inspiration.
Right. Yeah.
Where there would be certain similarities or certain dissimilarities that would, due to the qualities of what this nature of consciousness or this tension between and we can go very basic and call it between being and not being. Right. And we can talk about that much later in terms of earlier discussions about how life, or not life, how it all began.
Sure.
Right. That when everything is the same, it becomes one, and one cannot be one. It has to differentiate itself into the many. And then when the many become all alike, as they eventually will, then you go back, from total being to non-being by virtue of definition, if nothing else. And then life or everything begins again. If there's no beginning, of course, it all just flows together. But with this conceptual field, we try to, I think the objective of consciousness with all of this sparking going on is to establish a sense of clarity.
Okay.
Right. That you've got all this stuff going on around you. You're going crazy, everything is in chaos, which of course is the natural order of things. So you're in a chaotic state, and consciousness lends itself to ordering things, right? Which is against entropy, which I think is what, the second law of thermodynamics or something like that. Where we try to organize everything, but the natural state is disorganization.
Sure.
So my ending question would be, is there a positive attribute towards consciousness, or I think you called it conceptual space, right? I think these two are strongly related, as being, a zero-sum game. But it may take, billions of years or whatever, or I don't believe in time. Time is a measurement of movement. But if things get to start slowing down, they're always talking about things in the universe, they're either speeding up or they're slowing down. And it's like that creates a sense of time, but time doesn't really exist if things don't move. Right? Dead stars or whatever. I mean, what are you going to do with a dead star or a black hole? Exactly. It's like, well, does it exist? Well, we can't even ask it if it exists or not, because it has no sense of time, which means it doesn't move, which means it doesn't exist. But it can be eternal because it doesn't exist, and therefore it doesn't change.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'll be more than happy to hear any response you have to that. And I'm complicating it very, very strongly, because I think this kind of interaction, my consciousness with the consciousness of other things, can suit itself towards the creative or the inspiration of things, right? Depending on the relationship of different levels of consciousness with each other.
Exactly.
Is my sense of consciousness applicable or relative to the other things sense of consciousness? We can have a granite which has no sense of time, and if we were to conclude that a granite does have consciousness, I would say compared to the longevity or the inertia of a block of granite or a mountain compared to a human whose lifespan is 70 plus years, más o menos, whatever, however you want to look at it. Then you're having to create, if you want to consciously interact with that block of granite,
right,
then we have to talk about what is the energy of inspiration that leads to that. Sure. What is your level of consciousness interaction? Because you may, if you just have fingers, and a block of granite, and you can't use any other tools other than your fingers, I would think we're pretty much into a homeostatic state where things are not going to change very quickly because of, what things are in their own constitution, including their own level of consciousness or the level of tension that exists between, may I say, two different objects.
Right.
And I would then say, does it have to be an object to be conscious? I want to know the answer to that too, because when a person dies, well, the energy, there's no death, of course. They just change states of living, of life. I mean, do they maintain their sense of consciousness? And what is the requisite for being able to change your state of energy? You're still living, and interact with other levels of energy at a different approach towards your sense of consciousness, which would change, once the body changes into a less stable state. What happens with that level of consciousness? Does it continue to exist? If so, in what form? Does it then interact with things on a more energetic level? Blah, 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 blah. Millions and millions of questions.
Yeah.
And as we go through this, maybe next time we get to talk about inspiration, and maybe as an element of determining which comes first, the chicken or the egg.
Sure.
Which came first? Of course, the answer to that question, chicken or egg, is the egg came first, at which some later time must have mutated or evolved into a chicken.
Okay. But how did the egg become into existence if it didn't have a chicken?
Well, in the process of, the question involves the chicken, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean that in order to have an egg, you must be a chicken.
Okay.
That eggs predated chickens, right? And that, because you've got in the evolutionary view of things, you could have been a pterodactyl. I don't know what the ancestor of a chicken is, dodo bird or whatever, but even predating its present evolutionary form as a chicken would mean that those creatures that led up to what we know as a chicken probably had eggs as well.
Right. Okay. It's
It's clear as mud.
That's interesting. I mean, there's a lot in that, what you was talking about, and the evolution to go with the chicken and the egg for a little while is, like, my understanding, just looking at planet Earth. So scientists, if you believe them, say that it was formed out of dust. So after millions of years after, they call what happened with the Big Bang, but the particular mass came together, which was planet Earth, and started circulating around another object, being the sun. And on that planet, that massive dirt, it was chemicals to start with, but which formed atoms, which formed molecules, and then came into this big ball. And then on that ball of dirt, because of the position of the sun, gave a spark, I guess, to a single-celled organism. I mean, before we even get there, the chemicals, creating DNA, and DNA then being engulfed in cell walls, that then these single-celled organisms went on to engulf other single-celled organisms, which gave us multicellular organisms, which in some ways, that first cell, or, coming from this primordial ooze that people talk about, the scientists talk about, gave life to an egg, essentially. So in that sense, I can see that the first thing that existed was an egg. And from there, the egg just got more complicated and complex. And yeah, talking about how with time, things evolve into what we have today, and things are still evolving. But to get back to the basics, I think the beautiful basics that you mentioned were being and not being. So in the not being state, I believe there is consciousness. Like you're saying, there's many stories about people dying and coming back from the dead and still having some sort of experience of consciousness. And not being, I think this is the space we're talking about, in the depth of consciousness. The not being space allows for being. And the analogy of the rubber band, I mean, when we talk about the universe, again, scientists saying everything's expanding like this huge rubber band. And that allows us to be in this experience of moving, which gives us that sense of being. If everything stops, I mean, even if me as an individual passed away and died, I'd still have a consciousness, I believe, but it would be in the not being realm. And until, yeah, that happens, I'm not sure exactly what it's going to be, how to explain the experience.
I think to have a thought about that is, for me, what they call the soul, right?
Right.
Is the intermediary between being one with everything, not having any level of consciousness, and everything that we become conscious of requires a representative body to be able to negotiate that relationship and how it applies to us. That, I think, is the soul. When you get rid of, when you alter life, so you know you're no longer we'll call it a living being, right? You're no longer Troy. Then your soul, which some people think is indestructible, is merely a free-floating energy that comes into play to help negotiate the being's sense of where they are.
Right.
So I think, so I don't believe, I think that once these concepts are introduced to a sentient being, they take control. I mean, let's say, okay, in the beginning was the word. Well, what was that word?
Sure.
Was it bird, 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 birdie, birdie, bird, like the song says, in the beginning was the word, 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 the bird is the word. Or if somebody said, okay, that's how we're going to begin life, where bird is the word. Or if somebody else came up and said, no, we've got this pure thing, this pure being. Let's just say that they're going to fashion life after, then you wouldn't have the same being, because that initial impetus leads to something that develops itself and the relationship of that being with its environment. And I think that, people become attached to it. They start rationalizing and trying to understand based on that initial concept of or bird, bird, bird. And they create a whole existence around that. So I think that, if you those are just two examples. Well, let's say we have infinite number of examples and they're extrapolated into, all fashion of being.
Sure.
So I think it's all really just a game. It's totally meaningless. It's not leading us anywhere. It's just a jumble, right? It makes about as much sense as a baby crying, trying to get some kind of response. Well, if I scream, that either means I'm going to get fed again, or they're going to let me scream. And then that whole being's existence forms around the instance of its formulation.
Sure.
So I think that, what we're playing with is just an infinitude of things that could be happening, and it's totally meaningless, and then somewhere along the way, we try to make definition out of this to assist us with a sense of security, which of course is false. There is no security. Then we come up with imaginary beings who are actually controlling it, and maybe even lends itself to the visitation of higher life from other places, right? Sure. But we're still dealing with dimensions and dimensionality. Exactly. If we're, living in the conceptual space, or as you said, right? It's we can create worlds just by thinking about them. Now, I just don't think that we're accomplished enough to be able to complete the evolution of those thoughts of what you were saying, about your ocean, and swimming around in it and all that sort of stuff. Well, if you're having it every night, maybe you're in the process of creation. Sure. At least you're somewhat conscious of what it is you're doing, because it can translate from a waking state to a sleeping state. So that in itself establishes its own, let's say, independent level of consciousness as a thing that is at least the combination of two other things: you and your imagination, or how you were inspired. Why are you inspired to do what? And then, all of those are not limited to the things and the levels of being and conceptualization that we know. Exactly. We don't know anything. We're like bacteria, in a wide, huge arena, and we're taking that everything we're thinking about is actually substantial or means something, but I don't think it does. I think we just try to make it into something because those are our own imaginings, and we try to give life to things that we conceive. Makes sense? Yeah. In a way.
So I think the simplicity of being and not being is what we have right now, and that's where I guess inspiration is actualized, but the source of the inspiration comes from not being. So like we're saying, the block of granite, and a human coming up to that block of granite, looking at that block of granite, maybe gives them a pathway, a connection to this not being, or the consciousness that's inside the granite, but the granite itself can't say, hey, why don't you come over here and carve a sculpture? And but in some sense, that's what's happening. The human being seeing this block and going, wow, I see a knight on a horse, and then just does, whether they've got tools or just start scratching away with their fingernails or whatever until they get the image, they're inspired to do something, and eventually they'll go, okay, it's now a knight riding a horse rearing up into the distance. And that was their inspiration, or the inspiration for that came from not being, which was inspired by a block of granite, which ultimately can, I guess, be a reminder of not being, because it doesn't have the complexity like we do of a human being that starts overthinking things and saying, clouding all the thoughts of why we're here and what we need to do.
I will, in closing,
Yeah.
introduce another item
Okay.
into our path,
Right.
which we're, next time we'll talk about inspiration.
Yeah.
But I think that one item that should not go unnoticed is that all of these things that we've been discussing so far are presuming that we have a relationship,
Oh yeah, relationships.
right?
Okay.
We're not we're not alone.
Sure.
We are not the only one at the table. We've
Sure.
got the block of granite.
Exactly.
We've got ideas swimming around in our head. We haven't even discussed,
Yeah.
where those things come from. So,
Exactly.
we can talk about that, but when we talk about inspiration, I would like to begin by acknowledging at least that inspiration comes from a result of a certain level of relationships.
I see that too.
Us in relation to something else.
Sure.
All right. Can we leave our confused audience there?
I think so.
I think so. I think we better get out of here while we still can. Thank you, Troy.
Yeah. Thank you, Danny.
Okay.
That's great.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye.
Ciao. Yes, sir. Bye-bye.